I consider it a crime to dispose of the lives of tankers like this. After all, tankers are not infantry. Wow, right? This desperate plea, written by an anonymous Russian soldier and published by a prominent military blogger, isn't just some isolated battlefield complaint. According to military analysts, it's actually a glaring symptom of a much larger systemic breakdown. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to examine the internal mechanisms of a massive military structure that appears to be literally collapsing under its own weight. To put this into perspective, the sheer scale of the crisis really comes down to some stark, undeniable math. In the first quarter of 2026, data from the Ukrainian General Staff and the Institute for the Study of War indicates Russian forces suffered over 85,000 losses. But in that exact same period, they only managed to recruit about 80,000 new soldiers. I mean, for a military apparatus that is entirely built on sheer volume, reaching a point where casualties mathematically outpace recruitment, that's a structural nightmare. Okay, let's dive into this. Based on recent intelligence, leaked internal documents, and real-time frontline reports, we're going to perform an autopsy of a failing military machine. We're going way beyond the daily headlines here to structurally analyze exactly how the Russian military is deteriorating from the inside out, failing across manpower, command, armor, and aerospace. So, to grasp the full picture, we'll follow this structure. First, the spiraling manpower crisis. Second, the 12-minute meat grinder. Third, paranoia and command purges. Fourth, tank units fighting without tanks. Fifth, the Air Force collapse. And sixth, how this machine is actively eating itself. Starting with part one, a spiraling manpower crisis, we're looking at the systematic depletion of Russian forces. So the initial strategy of just throwing overwhelming numbers at layered defenses, it was totally unsustainable. And by late 2025, the well had truly run dry. Recruiters have already exhausted the prisons. They've waived medical exemptions to draft patients with HIV and hepatitis C. They've coerced ethnic minorities and even trafficked foreign nationals under totally false pretenses. But the absolutely most alarming new target? University students. Prestigious institutions are now offering these massive sign-on bonuses, equivalent to roughly $56,000, just to lure failing students into signing contracts. And they're falsely told these contracts will somehow keep them safely away from the front lines. Now, keep in mind, the partial mobilization decree from 2022 is actually still active. That means there are no fixed-term contracts. Once you sign, you belong to the Ministry of Defense. Which brings us to the most urgent question of this explainer. What exactly is waiting for these recruits when they finally reach the battlefield? Which brings us to part two, the 12-minute meat grinder. Let's look inside the Stepnohirsk death trap. To really get the tactical reality on the ground, we have to look at Stepnohirsk. It's this desolate, heavily drone-monitored high ground on the way to Zaporizhia. 12 minutes. Let that sink in. According to Ukrainian intelligence and special forces operating in the area, 12 minutes is the average life expectancy of a newly mobilized Russian soldier sent into this specific kill zone. Because Ukrainian forces hold the high ground, they utilize an impenetrable web of reconnaissance and explosive FPV drones. Once a Russian soldier crosses into this contested terrain, they are tracked and targeted almost instantly. But you know, the horror doesn't just come from the opposing side. Captured Russian soldiers are reporting this terrifying reality right behind their own lines. If a soldier refuses to march into that 12-minute meat grinder, they face what's known as zeroing, which is summary execution by their own commanders. The only alternative, according to the Institute for the Study of War, is massive corruption. We're talking soldiers paying bribes upwards of $40,600 just to be kept off the assault rosters. Moving on to part three, paranoia and command purges, the systematic dismantling of military leadership. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the battlefield chaos perfectly reflects the political paranoia at the absolute highest levels, the brain of the operation, so to speak. Following the removal of former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, this sweeping purge began, completely under the guise of anti-corruption. Key logistical and communications directors have been systematically arrested, sentenced, or, in the highly suspect case of Yuri Sadavenko, died under mysterious circumstances. Analysts from the Center for European Policy Analysis suggest this isn't genuine reform at all. Instead, it's a paranoid autocrat scapegoating his military leadership for the war's massive strategic failures, intentionally creating a climate of fear among the elite just to protect himself. That leads us to part four, tank units without tanks. The literal collapse of mechanized warfare. So obviously, a modern military relies heavily on mechanized warfare, but sources are revealing this staggering, kind of absurd situation. Russian tank units are actively fighting without their tanks. While you'd absolutely expect top-tier T-90 main battle tanks to be leading these assaults, commanders are actually parking their armor 20 kilometers behind the front lines. Why? Because Ukrainian drone swarms and layered minefields make the approach a complete suicide mission for heavy vehicles. As a result, highly specialized tank crews are being drafted as standard infantry, ordered to charge heavily fortified positions on foot or, astonishingly, on completely unarmored motorcycles and dirt bikes. It's wild. And the math completely confirms why they're hiding the armor. Visual evidence proves over 4,000 Russian tanks have been destroyed, with Ukrainian estimates suggesting Russia is losing up to 3,000 tanks annually. Meanwhile, their manufacturing sector, which is just crippled by sanctions, is optimistically producing maybe 428 tanks a year. This deficit is so extreme that Russia is now pulling T-55 tanks from the 1950s out of storage, welding on these crude metal grates known as cope cages, and sending them to the front. Let's transition to part 5, the Air Force collapse. Jets literally disintegrating from the inside out. See, the collapse isn't just confined to the dirt. The Russian aerospace forces, which were expected to secure air superiority within days, are quite literally disintegrating from the inside out. A leaked flight safety report from late 2025 exposed this grim reality. Because pilots have to fly at extreme tempos at super low altitudes to avoid Ukrainian air defenses, their maintenance intervals have shrunk dramatically. The report documented 24 severe incidents in just 3 weeks. And get this, that's without a single Ukrainian shot fired. The most common sequence? Extreme engine wear leading to cockpit alerts of metal shavings and oil, which is then immediately followed by uncommanded mid-air engine shutdowns. Honestly, the sheer volume of these structural failures is jaw-dropping. We have records of a Su-34 fighter spontaneously dropping a massive guided bomb onto its own runway during takeoff. We've got a MiG-8 helicopter returning to base with a massive hole blown right through it, entirely consistent with friendly fire from their own air defenses. At the industrial level, sanctions have totally cut off access to vital Japanese CNC machining parts that are required to build new jets. And as a direct result of these highly visible, embarrassing failures, Russia's once lucrative arms exports have plummeted by an estimated 92%. Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, a machine eating itself, the systemic failure across all military branches. So the crucial point we see here is that this is no longer just a series of isolated setbacks. It is a systemic failure across all military branches. The manpower crisis, the collapse of armor, the complete disintegration of the Air Force, they all tie back to a paranoid command structure that refuses to acknowledge reality. It's resulting in a machine that is actively cannibalizing itself just to survive another day. And behind all these statistics, behind the destroyed vehicles, is a staggering human cost. One of those university students targeted by recruitment lies perfectly summarized the domestic tragedy unfolding right now. They said, "I never imagined that my beloved university would become something I'd be protecting my friends from. But that is what Putin's Russia is today. It's a state consuming its own youth, its own institutions, and its own future to feed a failing war." We've looked at the data, the battlefield realities, and the sheer systemic decay running from the deepest trenches all the way up to the highest offices in Moscow, which leaves us with one final profound question to consider. How long can a military system running entirely on fear, lies, and cannibalized parts actually survive before the entire structure simply caves in? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.